I'm Marco Solorio from OneRiver Media. In this video, I'm comparing the Canon 5D Mark III and the new Blackmagic Design Cinema Camera. I wouldn't call this a shootout video or a versus video, but I did want to see just how well my cinema camera would work in some of the same shooting environments as my beloved DSLR cameras. Anyone that knows me knows I've been a huge advocate of HDSLR shooting from the very beginning, starting with the 5D Mark II when it was first released in late 2008. Since that time, I've used HDSLRs in all kinds of productions throughout the world. And then one day, literally out of left field, came the Blackmagic Cinema Camera. With similar cost and physical size, will the cinema camera replace my 5D and 7D for HDSLR productions? At this point, we all know the specs. 13 stops of dynamic range, 12-bit RAW, ProRes HQ. It's quick to assume the answer would be yes. But then there's that nagging issue in regards to the cinema camera's sensor size. Oh, it's smaller than Micro Four Thirds, but it's larger than Super 16. Oh, what to do? Honestly, both cameras have some interesting results that even surprised me. So hopefully some of the comparison footage I'm about to show you will help you judge for yourself if the cinema camera is up to the task. Let's get started. Okay, so here's our first shot using the Canon 5D Mark III. At first glance, the shot looks good in its own right. Levels are pushed strong, just shy of deterioration. But when we see the same shot from the cinema camera, we immediately see how much more sharpness and color information there is. Looking at the left arrow shows the shingles washed out. The top right arrow shows banding in the sky, and the bottom arrow lacks detail. The grass actually had that golden look that the cinema camera renders. Pointing the camera directly at the sun, the 5D's image first appears to hold up well, until we compare it to the cinema camera, where we now see an increase in sharpness and dynamic range. The sun doesn't blow out, and the surrounding image detail is maintained. The left arrow shows the lack of dynamic range that doesn't allow the blue sky to peek between the leaves. The other two arrows show a solarization effect in the shadow areas due to the overloading by the highlights of the sun. Another high detail shot for the 5D to undertake. At this point, we're really pushing the saturation on these clips. Once again, the cinema camera reveals a huge increase in clarity and dynamic range. All the trees and bushes are crisp, and the sky retains its blue. Again, no physical ND or grad filter is used at all. Even the family of ducks are easier to recognize. The left arrow in the sky reveals banding. The right arrow reveals lack of definition, and the bottom arrow lacks clarity in the family of ducks. Here we are in downtown San Francisco. Ungraded, this 5D shot looks pretty good. The same shot from the cinema camera reveals a bit more lens flare from the 24mm lens, but otherwise, there's a ton more dynamic range and detail. Let's replay and compare. Okay, so let's pause the video here. The arrow shows the opal sign illegibly blown out. As we move down, we get white blobs for headlights. Moving right, the rear quarter panels of these cars are blown out with no detail. And of course, the Mel's drive-in sign is blown out and unreadable. Okay, let's play forward a little bit. And pause. Here again, the Mel's sign is totally blown out, with drive-in completely disappeared. And just below it, another big white blob. This is very interesting. Look at the lack of detail and numerous blob spots inside the diner. The cinema camera retains full detail. Moving on, notice the shadow detail in this blue car, not black, and of course the highlight detail in the headlights. And from headlights, look at the blown out highlight detail in this white car's body. At the same intersection, I wanted to get a fast panning shot for rolling shutter. The skew in the background isn't really bad on both cameras. The 5D blows out the cab's dome light, and the tires have almost no shadow detail. Okay, time for some depth of field. Here's the 5D just about wide open on the 50mm lens. Note the blown out bokeh circles in the back. Now the cinema camera wide open on the 24mm lens. Bokeh is about half the size, but it's also not blown out. Now here's the trick. Slap that 50 on the cinema camera from the 5D, step back a few feet, and voila, same bokeh size as the 5D, if not bigger, and with no blowouts. Here's the 5D with the 50 again. Also note the hair detail. And back again to the cinema camera with the 50 and stepped back. Gotta love those old E&G tricks. And again, note the hair detail compared to the 5D. Here we're shooting for detail, as well as spatial and temporal compression artifacts. Blown up 400%, the 5D actually did way better than I thought it would, due in part to its new iframe compression option. There's really no perceivable macro blocking. Here the cinema camera shows its strength and detail. With 12-bit RAW and 5 MB per frame images, there's zero chance of any macro blocking. On the widest end, I can actually get wider on the cinema camera than I did on the 5D. On the longest end, there's no surprise the cinema camera would reach further with its crop factor. Still impressive though. The 5D actually does pretty well here, considering its H.264 and 420 color space. Here the cinema camera really grabs that green screen, and edging is razor sharp. Blown up 1000%, we can see how the 5D fringes the edges in its limited 420 color space. With the cinema camera, there is no chrominance subsampling loss at all. But when it comes down to the keying process, hair detail clumps up and edges become soft on the 5D. On the cinema camera, the added color resolution is immediately obvious. Individual hairs are retained. Despite the lack of contrast and sharpness in the 5D Mark III, the image is clean and far superior to the older 5D Mark II. As I begin to pan the camera more vigorously, we see the rolling shutter in action. At the debayering stage, I can minimize or maximize contrast with the cinema camera. I can always bring it down if I feel the contrast is overpowering the frequency detail and causing moire. And here we get rolling shutter. Look familiar? That's because it is. As we do a side-by-side comparison, we can see that both cameras exhibit the same amount of rolling shutter. I was hoping there would be a little less rolling shutter when I first used the cinema camera, but to my surprise, it's literally identical to the 5D. Blown up 400%, we can see how much more contrast and detail there is in the cinema camera. Starting at 200 ISO with the 5D for some dynamic range testing. Keep your eye on the top right highlight zones here. Now at 400 ISO on the 5D, 800 ISO, and finally 1600 ISO. The last three highlight zones are clipped. Okay, it's the cinema camera's turn, starting at 200 ASA, then 400 ASA, 800 ASA, and finally 1600 ASA. The image retains all highlight zones. Let's compare. Knowing all us Canon DSLR shooters work in 160 ISOs, I've included it at the bottom. Ramping up the exposure again as before. Finally cranking up the exposure, we see both 5D images clipping the highlight zones. So there you have it. Personally, I'm in love with the images I'm getting from the cinema camera. The clarity and the detail is crystal clear. The amount of latitude I have in post-production allows me to push levels for miles. With 13 stops of dynamic range, I can literally shoot directly into light sources and it doesn't blow out the surrounding area or the entire image for that matter. There's no question the 5D Mark III is the low light king, but on the same token, the cinema camera is no slouch. With the added dynamic range of 12-bit RAW, you can tap into shadow and highlight areas and pull image data to help accomplish low light shooting. And let's face it, even if you shoot ProRes HQ or DNx HD with the cinema camera, you'll still be leagues ahead of any H.264 codec in a DSLR. Even as good as the iframe option is in the 5D Mark III. And with RAW, you're in a whole different league entirely. But let's be clear, shooting RAW requires added workflow, time, budget, and storage. If you can handle that, then you're golden. If not, then ProRes HQ or DNx HD will still give you superior quality and workflow ease. There's no question. So will the cinema camera replace my HDSLR productions? I can honestly and firmly say yes. There's no question. Frankly, for me, the sensor size isn't an issue, whether shooting wide or even under some low light situations. Would I rather have a Super 35 sensor in there? Of course I would. But for a $3,000 camera with these great specs, I can happily make this sensor work for me. Does the cinema camera have its quirks? Sure it does, just like any camera really. But at version 1.0, there's bound to be firmware updates, and all free to boot. To me, it's great now and will continue to get better with time. Yep, I'm sold. Lastly, if you haven't seen our latest video using the cinema camera in a real-world production environment with cast and crew, go check it out. It's called Texting ist gefährlich, which translated from German means texting is dangerous. The main purpose was to really push the camera in harsh conditions at night, with punchy lighting while only utilizing minimal production gear. Sure, we have a facility full of production and lighting gear to have otherwise produced a glossy beauty video, but instead, we stepped out of our comfort zone to really see if the camera could handle the task. Some people loved the video and got what we were trying to do, while others, they didn't love it so much and really didn't grasp our motive. But it's okay. Personally, I loved shooting it, but most importantly, I gathered specific knowledge of the cinema camera in these extreme conditions and how to fine-tune that knowledge for now and in future productions. Something a glossy beauty video wouldn't have given me. I know for a fact that had I shot the video using a DSLR, I absolutely wouldn't have gotten the same dynamic range and detail that the cinema camera gave me. Not by a long shot. Well, that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers.